There is a specific, terrifying brand of cruelty unique to those who wrap themselves in the cloak of righteousness. They are the pillars of the community, the ones who pass the collection plate on Sunday morning, their smiles polished to a blinding gleam. But behind closed doors, the veneer cracks, revealing a hollow, rotting core. You learn early on that the loudest proponents of law and order are usually the ones who believe the rules apply to everyone but them. For decades, I watched this hypocrisy play out in my own home, swallowing the poison to keep the peace. But there comes a point when the collateral damage becomes too great, when the instinct to protect your own child overrides the ingrained, suffocating obligation to blood. Sometimes the only way to stop a monster is to stop fighting them in the dark, and instead drag them under the harsh, unforgiving fluorescent lights of federal bureaucracy. The breaking point arrived in late August. The heat outside was oppressive, radiating off the pavement and bleeding through the walls of my living room, but the chill inside my chest was absolute. I was recovering physically and mentally from a second silent miscarriage. It was a raw, gaping wound of a loss, something delicate that I foolishly decided to share with my father, Garrett, and my stepmother, Blythe. I had hoped, against decades of empirical evidence, for a shred of parental empathy. Instead, the conversation curdled. It devolved, as it always did with Garrett, into a bitter political lecture. He stood by my kitchen island, his posture rigid, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive linen shirt. With a terrifyingly calm, conversational tone, he looked me in the eye and said that given his political beliefs, it would have been perfectly acceptable if I had died from sepsis during the ordeal. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, ringing with the sheer brutality of his words. I looked over at Blythe. She sat on the velvet armchair, her hands neatly folded in her lap, nodding in quiet agreement. Something inside me, a fragile tether I had maintained for 30 years, simply snapped. The eviction was immediate. I told them to pack their things and get out of my house. Instead of a graceful exit, they initiated a siege. They retreated to the guest room, and for the next hour, the muffled sounds of destruction echoed down the hallway. Drawers were slammed so hard the drywall shuddered. Hangers were snapped. Picture frames were shoved off nightstands, the glass fracturing against the hardwood. When I finally marched down the hall, desperate to reclaim the sanctity of my home, they were dawdling, yelling vicious, venomous insults about my character, my home, my life. I reached out and grabbed Garrett's heavy leather suitcase, intending to drag it to the front porch to force their hand. Garrett lunged, his face twisted into an ugly, unfamiliar snarl, his hand shooting out to grab my collar. I twisted away, but his momentum carried him forward, and his heavy knuckles clipped my shoulder. A sharp, blunt impact that sent me stumbling backward. Blythe immediately materialized in the doorway, her face flushed red, trailing behind me as I backed away. Her shrill voice bounced off the walls, screaming that I was an ungrateful, wretched daughter, a failure who deserved every misery life handed her. I locked the front door behind them with trembling, bruised hands, the metallic click echoing like a gunshot in the suddenly empty house. The boundary I set the next morning was absolute. There would be no further contact. They were not safe, they were not decent, and they would never be allowed anywhere near my toddler daughter Cleo. Garrett, of course, did not respect boundaries. To him, the word no was merely a challenge. He immediately began a campaign of triangulation, blowing up the phones of my mother and my sister, Maura. They ignored him. They knew exactly who he was. Maura especially bore the scars of his specific brand of psychological warfare. Growing up, Garrett used to force Maura to stand in front of a full-length mirror, pointing out her flaws, systematically destroying her self-worth under the guise of tough love. When Maura finally escaped and bought her own house, Garrett didn't let go. He stalked her realtor's social media, found a candid photo of my newly postpartum sister, and called me explicitly to mock her weight. When she moved again to escape him, he spent days digging through obscure county tax records just to find her new address so he could mail her insidious, gaslighting letters. He was a relentless predator, constantly circling, looking for a weak point in the fence. When he couldn't get through to Maura or my mother, Garrett escalated. He realized the most devastating weapon he could wield against me wasn't his own anger but my past trauma. For months behind my back, Garrett and Blythe began reaching out to Vance. Vance was my ex-husband. He was also the man who had spent 3 years systematically abusing me, isolating me, and tearing my life down to the studs before I barely managed to escape with Cleo. The ink on the restraining orders had barely faded. Garrett knew exactly what Vance had done to me. He knew the nightmares, the panic attacks, the terrified glances over my shoulder in grocery store parking lots. And yet Garrett and Blythe sought Vance out, offering him an alliance, feeding him information, all in a twisted bid to gain access to Cleo and punish me for my defiance. I found out through a horrifyingly casual Facebook notification, a screenshot forwarded by a mutual acquaintance. Seeing Vance's name alongside my father's in a digital exchange sent a shockwave of nausea so violent I had to grip the edge of the sink to stay upright. I was forced to break years of absolute silence and contact Vance. I laid out a fraction of the unhinged, malicious things Garrett and Blythe had tried to pull during our divorce proceedings, things even Vance, in all his malice, found deeply unsettling. It was enough to make the ex-husband back away, but Garrett and Blythe didn't stop. They kept trying to digitally pry the door open, messaging him again just 2 weeks ago. I had sent 10 separate, documented requests for them to cease and desist. 10 warnings that if they didn't back off, I would use every option at my disposal to protect my peace. They ignored every single one, drunk on their own perceived untouchability. I was exhausted. My bones ached with the constant vigilance. But beneath the exhaustion, a cold, crystalline fury began to crystallize. Screaming matches wouldn't work. Reason was useless. The only way to stop people who operate with absolute impunity is to introduce them to a bigger, meaner predator. Garrett and Blythe were wealthy, comfortable, and deeply hypocritical. They lived in a sprawling suburban estate, but their true cash cow was a massive, highly lucrative cannabis grow facility they owned 2 states away. It was a business they kept quiet among their conservative, church-going social circles. Because they lived out of state, they managed the operation by flying back and forth several times a month. And because they were arrogant, they were incredibly, remarkably sloppy. They hated paying for secure, licensed interstate transport. Instead, they would routinely vacuum-seal pounds of high-grade cannabis, stuff it into their checked Rimowa luggage, and hop on a commercial flight back home. They did this constantly. Interstate drug trafficking, casual as a weekend getaway. To compound the absurdity, Garrett held an active, highly regulated Series 7 securities license. His entire financial career hinged on a pristine legal record and strict adherence to federal laws. Involvement in a federally illegal substance, let alone trafficking it across state lines, was a career-ending violation. The final piece of the puzzle, the absolute death blow to any lingering, misplaced guilt I might have harbored, came during a Sunday visit to my grandmother, Nanette. Nanette was 95, frail, smelling of peppermint and old paper, her mind still sharp but her body failing. While helping her organize her mail, I found a stack of bank statements. A massive, gaping hole existed in her savings, over $100,000 siphoned out over 2 years. When I gently pressed her, Nanette wept, her thin shoulders shaking. Garrett and Blythe had pressured her into loaning them the money for a business expansion. They hadn't paid back a single cent, and when she asked, Garrett had screamed at her until she cried, threatening to put her in a state-run nursing home if she ever brought it up again. Financial abuse of a 95-year-old woman, that was the cherry on top. The decision was no longer a question of if, but how thoroughly I could dismantle them. I spent weeks meticulously compiling the dossier. I worked late into the night, the blue light of my laptop illuminating the quiet kitchen, the rhythmic hum of the refrigerator my only company. I gathered property records for the grow facility. I pulled Garrett's public FINRA broker records. I compiled years of flight itineraries I had saved in my email from when we were still on speaking terms, cross-referencing their travel dates with their business ledgers I had once helped them format. I gathered bank transfer receipts from Nanette's accounts. I became a ghost in the machine, devoid of emotion, operating with the clinical precision of a surgeon excising a tumor. The first report went to the state cannabis regulatory agency where their facility was located. I provided exact dates, flight numbers, and detailed descriptions of how the product was being illegally diverted across state lines, bypassing taxation and seed-to-sale tracking. The second report was submitted directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission and FINRA, attaching the cannabis business ownership documents and outlining Garrett's direct violation of federal laws governing licensed brokers. The third report was a detailed, anonymous tip to the Transportation Security Administration and the Federal Aviation Administration, flagging their specific names, frequent flyer numbers, and exact methodology for trafficking narcotics on commercial airlines. Finally, I filed a comprehensive elder financial abuse report with Adult Protective Services in Nanette's County, handing over the bank records and communications. When I clicked the final submit button, the silence in the kitchen felt different. It wasn't the heavy, anxious silence of waiting for the next attack. It was the vast, breathable quiet of the eye of a storm right before it makes landfall on someone else's shore. The fallout was not immediate, which only made it sweeter. Bureaucracy is a slow, grinding wheel, but once it catches the fabric of a sleeve, it pulls the whole body in. 3 weeks later, I received a frantic, unhinged voicemail from an unknown number. It was Blythe, her voice entirely stripped of its usual haughty superiority. It was jagged with panic. They had been pulled out of the TSA pre-check line at the airport. Their luggage had been thoroughly, publicly dismantled by federal agents. Within a month, the dominoes began to fall in rapid succession. The Cannabis Regulatory Agency suspended their operating license pending an investigation into product diversion, effectively freezing their income. FINRA opened an inquiry into Garrett, placing an immediate public blemish on his pristine broker record, causing his firm to place him on unpaid administrative leave. Adult Protective Services froze the remaining assets attached to Nanette, initiating a brutal audit of Garrett's finances. They were suddenly drowning in legal fees, federal audits, and the sheer, unmanageable terror of losing their curated public image. They had no time to stalk my sister. They had no time to message my abusive ex-husband. They were entirely consumed by the inferno of their own arrogance. There is a profound, almost terrifying peace that settles over a home when the wolves are finally caught in a trap of their own making. I look at Cleo now, watching her stack brightly colored blocks on the living room rug, entirely oblivious to the monsters that tried to claw their way to her. She will never know the sting of Garrett's insults. She will never feel the cold, dismissive glare of Blythe. She will grow up in a house where love is not conditional, where boundaries are ironclad, and where safety is an absolute guarantee. We are taught to forgive, to turn the other cheek, to keep the family intact at all costs. But some debts cannot be paid with forgiveness. Some actions require a reckoning. If someone threatens your peace, your safety, and the well-being of your child, you do not owe them your silence. You owe them the exact, precise consequences of their own actions. Protect your peace, build your fortress, and never be afraid to let the architects of your misery live in the ruins they created. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to draw a hard line in the sand against toxic family members, hit the subscribe button. Drop a comment below and share how you protected your own peace. Until next time, keep your boundaries strong and your loved ones close.